Good morning. Oh, come on, this is DC. We know how to do this. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm Chris Murphy, Vice President for Government Relations and Community Engagement at Georgetown, and we are really delighted that you're all here with us this morning for what we expect to be a terrific conversation. So literally exactly 4 weeks from today, the My School DC lottery application process will open for this year. And students and their families will be able to apply for admission next fall to some of the best traditional public and public charter schools in the country, in a school that has arguably the most public school choice in the country. So what better time than to come together and review the effectiveness of the lottery that was launched 6 years ago and profiled a little earlier this year in the Washington Post magazine piece authored by Georgetown's FutureEd team. I think a copy of the article is in your folder. But we wanted to come together, review the effectiveness of the lottery, and discuss how the lottery continues to evolve to best meet the needs of DC students and families. On behalf of Georgetown, I want to take a moment to thank Mayor Bowser for hosting us here in G9 at the John A. Wilson Building. This is one of many policy-focused events that Georgetown has convened here at the Wilson Building in partnership with the DC government, and we're grateful. In particular, we want to thank Deputy Mayor Paul Kine and his team for arranging for us to be here. Thank you, Paul. So today's event is co-sponsored by three key partners, and I want to just recognize and introduce each one of them. The first is the organization that most folks know as PAVE. I actually learned something when I looked up what PAVE stood for, which is Parents Amplifying Voice in Education. Founded just a few years ago in 2016, PAVE has quickly become an important voice in the DC education scene, and with an all-parenting governing board, works to ensure that communities and parents are effective partners in creating great schools. And as they say, where the vision for education is created with children and families, not for them. You will hear from PAVE's Executive Director, Amaya Martin Cadogan, in just a moment. The second partner is FutureEd, a program at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. FutureEd is an independent, solution-oriented think tank that focuses on excellence, quality, equity, and efficiency in K-12 and higher education on behalf of the nation's disadvantaged students. We appreciate their special interest in DC. FutureEd is led by the terrific Tom Toch that many of you know, and you'll hear from Tom a little bit later. And the third and final partner is Georgetown's DC Public Policy Initiative. So this initiative seeks to better connect the university and our unique public policy expertise with issues important to the District of Columbia. Our past work has focused on topics such as the state of African Americans in DC, the efficacy of the district's law allowing undocumented residents to obtain driver's licenses, and most recently, the working conditions of DC drivers of ride-sharing companies such as Uber and Lyft. And today, we can think of no more important topic to focus on than public education here in the District of Columbia. In just a moment, you will hear two short presentations from Catherine Peretti, who's actually the Executive Director of the My School DC Lottery. And then, as I mentioned, Maya Martin Cadogan from PAVE will also make a brief presentation. After that, FutureEd's Tom Toch will moderate a conversation with a terrific panel that we've been able to put together, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So start thinking about what you want to ask now. But first, we are delighted to have with us this morning three extraordinary district leaders whose focus and leadership on education in the district is inspiring, critical, impactful. You picked the adjective. Each of them will offer some brief welcoming and context-setting remarks, and then I also would, as a point of privilege, would note that two of them are Georgetown alums, so those Georgetown values at work. First, you will hear from Deputy Mayor for Education, Paul Kine, then DC Councilmember David Grasso, who, as you know, chairs the Education Committee here at the Council, who we're proud to claim as a Georgetown Law alum, and then DC State Superintendent of Education and alum of our School of Foreign Service, Hansel Kang. But Paul Kine, would you start us off?
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone. I wanted to start with also a round of thanks to Chris and Tom, Maya for actually organizing this event. Thank you to Hansel Kang, Cat Peretti, and the whole My School DC team for all your extraordinary work. which we'll be celebrating and discussing today. Councilmember Grasso for your collaboration and ongoing support across the education sector. We are truly at an extraordinary moment in DC, in our extraordinary city. Overall, our enrollment continues to climb. DCPS topped 50,000 students this year. Over the next 10 years, our public schools will see an additional 10,000 students come into the halls of our schools. And our academic performance is truly astonishing. The recent NAEP results showed that DC continues to be the fastest improving state in the country. DCPS and its portion of those results showed it to be continuing to improve. Every year, we have a relentless improvement in our high quality and high standard PARCC exams. This is unprecedented and sustained. And so we have a lot to be thankful for. Now, while we clearly have lots of work still to do, I think the reason that we're seeing this improvement is because the bold policy moves and the quite extraordinary investment that we have made over the past 10 years is indeed paying off. And those bold policy moves include setting very high standards and expectations for all students in the city, including through our PARCC exam. We've got equitable school funding. We have ongoing support for a vibrant charter sector alongside our support for the traditional school system. And the educator policy work that's embodied in impact and coaching in DCPS is surely part of the reason that we're seeing these improvements as well. But one of the other extremely important bold policy moves that we made includes the common unified lottery, which is in some ways the backbone of this thriving system. And the lottery is interesting because, on the one hand, it is truly a tool for parents and families to help them navigate better and more efficiently and effectively through a very complex system. It is also a very important policy tool. And the way that we think about setting preferences and the way we think about inviting schools to engage in it from a policy perspective is also important to ensure we're achieving our goals around equity and access. So I welcome this discussion, which is both a reflection on the success that we've had and the work of the lottery, but it is also an opportunity for us to think about the lottery as a tool to continuously push ourselves in the directions of increased equity and increased access. So with that, and on behalf of Mayor Bowser, I welcome you all here, and thank you again.
Good morning, everyone. I am Councilmember Grasso. I'm the chair of the Committee on Education, and I am also here to welcome you to this incredibly important and interesting discussion. Thank you to Georgetown. Obviously, it seems like Georgetown's been following me around lately, which I appreciate. I was at the Nats game, and all the cheerleaders were there, and here we are here. And, to PAVE, the reality is that PAVE has brought a parent voice to the table in a way that I've never seen before in the 8 years that I've been doing education in the District of Columbia. So thank you again for stepping up for this event. I remember being from DC when parents used to camp out in front of schools for sometimes more than one night just to get a spot in a school that they thought was a high-performing place where they wanted to put their daughter or their son. And the fact is that we've come a long way since then. I know that when we started this out, it was done in the deputy mayor's office, and now it's transitioned smoothly over to OSSI, which is incredibly impressive. But what it does, and what I love about the My School DC program and the Common Lottery, is that it actually makes choice a reality in the District of Columbia. Rather than having to guess and wonder whether or not you're going to go here or go there, you can actually put your preferences down and have some idea of where you're going to go ahead of time and not be totally strung out wondering what's going to happen with your child. So it's amazing the number of choices we have, but if you don't have the tools to actually implement that choice in a meaningful way based in data and based in real access, which means being able to do it online, being able to understand who the schools are, This is the backbone of that work. Not to mention all of the other work that we've been doing to try to bring data to the forefront for parents to make the best choice in DC. Without My School DC, you wouldn't be able to implement that choice at all. So welcome to the District of Columbia building. The DC Council as well welcomes you, the Committee on Education, and I look forward to seeing the conversation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Huntsville Kang. I'm the State Superintendent of Education in DC, and we are so pleased to be here for this event, showcasing the work of the My School DC team and then the entire Common Lottery program, which the city has come together around. I'm very proud of the work that My School DC has done, in particular in leveling the playing field for DC families who are seeking the best school option for their children, and also in making continuous improvements so that DC families continue to have greater access to schools across DC, access to the information and data they need, and as smooth of a Common Lottery experience as is possible. Given the education landscape in DC, with our student population divided nearly evenly between Dcps and then more than 60 different charter local education agencies, we are particularly committed to ensuring that families have the support they need to navigate our education system. As Councilmember Grasso started to describe, it's really important, I think, to look back at where we've come from to recognize fully the benefits of the current situation that we have. Previously, before the lottery, families who were seeking to choose a school had to navigate disparate applications, timelines, and processes at different schools. Because of the highly decentralized system and different application requirements, families often struggled to navigate the different deadlines and to navigate the complicated system. DCPS and each public charter school had developed their own lottery programs, competing for students, and without being able to share timely and comprehensive information, and without necessarily a view towards the citywide impact on families and children. And so the process just became more and more complicated as the number of schools in the city rose. Families also had limited avenues to get support with an application, apart from showing up at a school in person or asking questions about the academic and extracurricular programming at the schools that they wanted to attend. And yet today, DC is now home to more than 230 public schools across both DCPS and our public charter schools, and more than 70% of our students are enrolling in schools through the lottery process. The experience of a family accessing schools in DC has evolved dramatically alongside the My School DC program. We are now at the forefront of innovative education technologies and serve as a national model for providing comprehensive information about schools to our families. We have made information about all of our schools accessible to all families within a single website and created a single application to complete and provided a streamlined process to choose among more than 200 schools. We've also put a special emphasis on supporting families from all backgrounds and being able to access this system. Anyone can call My School DC's multilingual hotline, visit a My School DC field office, or get online help from a staff member. And school staff and public library staff are also trained in the My School DC process. My School DC team focuses particularly on contact with low-income families, language minority communities, and transient youth through advertising, canvassing, phone banking, workshops, and target events, as well as partnerships with many of the folks in this room. In 2019, for example, My School DC engaged more families than ever before, staffing more than 100 events, distributing more than 50,000 guides, responding to more than 4,000 hotline inquiries. And last year at EdFest, we had more than 7,000 participants come out to learn about all of our schools. We look forward to continuing to support families across the city, and we also continue to be proud of how this particular program exemplifies a successful collaboration between our traditional public and public charter sectors in coming together to design a process and a platform that is in the best interest of families. We look forward to continuing to work with the cross-sector board that supports the major policy changes to the program, and also the important advice from our representative Parent Advisory Council, which ensures that parent voice is at the heart of how we support our lottery program. OSSE is proud to support My School DC and to continue to work with all of you to ensure we have our families have as strong of an access as possible to all of our incredible schools across the city. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Cat Peretti.
Great. Hello, everybody. I'm Cat Peretti. I'm the Executive Director of My School DC. I'm very impressed by the turnout. And I'm here to give you a little bit of an overview of what My School DC is. I think we've got a lot of experts in the room, but maybe also some that are new. We are the Common Lottery and Common Application Program for all of our 230 plus public schools in the district. We are a single online-only application, and we serve almost 100% of the schools that are pre-K 3 through 12th grade in the district. At this point, we have near 100% opt-in participation, and the only schools that don't participate with us are those that are serving special populations. So we are really proud that we started with about 85% participation, and we're now at full strength here. We have seen over our 6 lottery cycles a really good proportion of our public school students in the district, because application is required to enter any public charter school, any pre-K program that's in a charter school or a traditional school, or any of our selective high schools, and then DCPS opens their schools to out-of-boundary students as well. It's just lottery access. So while we don't see every child every year, at this point, about 73% of our school students are attending a public school that's not their in-boundary school. And those schools are lottery access. So as our population has grown, as our school numbers have grown, so have our application numbers. And as our outreach tactics have become more sophisticated, more strategic at reaching everybody in the city, we've seen our numbers go up and our number of children matched go up. Now, sometimes people look at this overall match rate and they think, oh, that looks low, but I need to remind everybody that this is every grade, even if it's not a typical entry grade. So this is all of the grades and their match rates, and then unmatched students still have options to go through our program. They can expand their search, they can look at our waitlist information, they can look at participating schools that have seats available, and they can go to their in-boundary school as well, even if they're not matched in that initial lottery round. We have a robust sort of post-lottery process as well. Our match rates are highest in Ward 7 and 8. That's where most of our public school students live. That's where most of our applications come from proportionally. And the highest match rates are also there, again, in all grades. Now, I wanted to talk about pre-K for a little bit, because this is a number that often surprises people. We have more seats available in the city in pre-K 3 than we do applicants for pre-K 3. And that's in our public schools, not even to speak of the numbers that we have in our community-based organizations that also offer free, publicly funded pre-K through our universal pre-K program. So sometimes you hear about how hard schools are to get into, and that, you know, the pre-K spots are few and far between. But there is a spot somewhere in the city for every pre-K aged 3-year-old. It's just that we have created this process for matching applicants to schools that they want most, and our match rate this last year was 87% for pre-K 3. So one of the aspects of My School DC, and one of the pieces that has evolved alongside our technology, is our outreach program. So we take a multi-pronged approach to reaching families. We have EdFest. It's coming up on December 14th. I hope everybody's planning to go to the Armory. But that is a citywide school fair where we have every public school in the district having a table, telling families what they have to offer to them in our public school system. We have traditional advertising that goes out in it, but it's targeted. We know where every Amharic grocery store, we have every Amharic speaking community, every Ethiopian grocery store, we know where they are. And we're putting flyers there to let families know about the lottery process in Amharic. We've got a field office, and we do in-person outreach. We have a 21-person representative parent advisory council that we meet with every quarter to talk about what are we thinking about, what are we doing, get their advice, on how we move forward in the lottery program. We also do a lot of social media. We have an email and text alert list that grows every year to get direct information into the hands of parents, make sure they don't miss the deadline for the lottery process. So this is a very important aspect of the program that ensures equity and transparency in what we're doing. And we've never found a perfect way to show the results of our outreach, but one of the things that we look for is parity between where do our public school students live and where are our applications coming from. We don't want to see a big imbalance in those numbers, so we look at how our application distribution across wards looks and how our public school enrollment distribution looks. And they're all within 2% of one another, which is something that we strive for because it shows at least that we are reaching all corners of the city with our messaging about how to access the lottery in the public schools here. And again, Ward 7 and 8 have the most public school students enrolled, and they have the highest number of applications through My School DC. We also, in recent years, have been really looking at our at-risk applicant patterns and trying to gauge the effectiveness of our outreach to communities that are at risk. And in DC, that means they are receiving temporary assistance for needy families, SNAP food stamps, or are a part of the foster system or identified as homeless. And so we don't collect that information on the application, but we look kind of after the fact to see, did we reach families? Are they making the deadline? And we have been growing that number of at-risk families making the deadline year over year, which is something that is very intentional and we're very proud of, but we're still not on point with the rest of the not at-risk families making the deadline. And so we're still working hard to get to those families. But this has been important information for us in developing policy. So we are piloting for the first time an at-risk preference with Dcps this year coming up for the Stevens School, which will be a newly opening early childhood and pre-K center. And a lot of these data on applicant patterns have been helpful to inform how we can think about that school and think about the preference and think about outreach to families going to that school. We also are survey crazy at My School DC because we want our program to be responsive to feedback. We have our parent constituency, which is the North Star. It's most important to us to reach out to families and to hear, how was your experience with this application? How was your experience with the lottery system? Did you get the school that you want? What could we do better? And we read every single comment every single year. We had 5,000 surveys this year, and we were poring over the comments. And we ask, were you satisfied with your lottery results? And we ask that a little bit separately from, were you satisfied with the My School DC program overall? Because we understand that it's a lottery, there's luck involved, and you might not get the school that you want, and that might feel a certain way, but you also might have a pretty good experience with the interface, with hotline staff that you interacted with. Our hotline staff is second to none in terms of responsiveness and helpfulness with parents. So we've seen pretty high satisfaction rates. We ask these questions out of 5 each year on our survey. And DC has been on the leading edge with New Orleans and with Denver as cities that do unified enrollment, choice-based systems that have common lotteries. And we are often asked with other cities that are coming online or trying to organize something similar to what we have, what are our key lessons learned? So the first thing that I always say is that a sustained investment in outreach and navigation is critical. We have a lot of information, especially with the DC report card, which was this incredible effort to get more information about schools out there online, but parents need help navigating it. And so it's not enough to just throw it all out there on the internet and say, hope you can make your list. Well, we need to walk them through. We need to help them navigate. We need that hotline support and more in-person support. PAVE does a great job. DC School Reform Now /Connect Ed does a great job sitting at kitchen tables and helping families understand what does this mean? How can I find a best fit school for my child? And that is critical. And then in terms of the technology, taking incremental steps has been the way that we have ensured success, both with bringing schools into this opt-in system and making sure that we are successful in launching these pretty complicated technology systems that link all of our schools together and all of our applicants to their results and their waitlist information. And we also recommend that our online-only model is the way to go because it's a digital world. Make your application smartphone compatible. Make sure that families don't have to go somewhere in order to access schools. And make sure that you can have good data. Because if you don't have good data, your match might not go terribly well. So our online-only model has been something that we have recommended to other cities, but you have to pair it with that outreach program so that it doesn't act as a barrier. So that's where we are. Great, thanks.
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Good. Well, I hope to jazz it up a little bit with hearing from some of the perspectives of parents. To share a little bit about myself, my name is Maya Martin Cadogan again, and I'm the founder and executive director of PAVE, which, as Chris Murphy shared, in the wonderful world of DC acronyms, stands for Parents Amplifying Voices in Education. And so Chris kind of shared a little bit about our mission and vision here at PAVE, but as he shared, it is, of course, to make sure that our education system in DC is created with families and not just for them. And in that perspective, it's always important that we hear from our families directly as we're thinking about how we're doing around public policy. And for us at PAVE, that's where we've seen one of the gaps in terms of our work is making sure that we're not just hearing from parents at the start of a process, but that we're hearing from them throughout a process to figure out how well we're doing at meeting their needs and identifying how we need to adapt and change the system to get to greater equity. I want to give a shout out to the My School DC team for what Kat has already described as a really extensive parent engagement process that they work through. And I see Ariane Bouquet in the back of the room who does their family engagement work and their work with community-based organizations who work directly with families. And I also want to give a shout out to Sujatha Bhatt, who's in the room. Who's the original founder and executive director of My School DC. And when this got started, Sujatha was really clear, her and Abby Smith at the very beginning, that we had to make sure that parent voice was a part of the decision-making process. And so just like we had an executive committee made up of charter school and DCPS leaders, we had a design committee made up of charter school and DCPS school staff. And then in addition, we had a parent advisory council from the very beginning that kind of weighed in on all of the decisions that we were making about the lottery. And so I think it's really important to understand that in terms of our public policy making processes, this is a good example of how we do that work with parent voice at the center and continue that throughout. So in terms of the work that we do here at PAVE, I shared that, we really believe that all of the conversations have to have the experiences of families at the center. So even when you come to a PAVE event, you'll see around the room that you see families everywhere. You see Brittany in her PAVE t-shirt, and you see the pictures and voices of families represented in the room so that we really have the spirit of families at the center of all that we're doing. Our goal, with My School DC is that we wanted to make sure that we understood how they were feeling about My School DC as a process and understanding how we can make sure to continue to improve the process so that it is really meeting their needs. And the way that we do this is two-part. So some of you might have seen that we did an online survey that we sent out via online, and I agree with Kat that an online world is the way to go, except sometimes some of these online processes can sometimes be barriers to engagement for families and can kind of be a little bit kind of intimidating and stressful. And so the way that we do that work is also making sure that we're actually going out into the community and getting direct feedback from families. And so our canvassing approach is to meet parents where they are. We go to rec centers, schools, daycares, Giant. We go wherever families are in order to make sure that we're understanding and reaching the widest swath of our families. So in terms of our data that we collected around how the lottery was going, the question is, who did we hear from? We actually had a little bit of a different spread than what Kat described in terms of balance of where kids are in the city. We did have a lower number in 2 and 3, which is where our lowest enrollment is, but we had a little bit more of an even spread of the 433 survey respondents that we had throughout the other wards. Ward 7 and 8 were still the highest, but there were close numbers, even for Ward 1, which tends to be a little smaller in terms of total enrollment. And then we heard from parents who speak different languages. And so you'll see that similar to DC, we had about 12% of families that spoke Spanish at home. In terms of our total surveys, 21 of those were in Spanish, but there's a difference between the number of families who are answering the survey in Spanish versus the number of families who also speak Spanish as a first language at home. And then in terms of the services, Kat referenced the at-risk population and the work that they're doing around the preferences. So at-risk students in DC represent about 46% of all kids in our DC schools, whether or not that's charter or traditional. And for our surveys, we actually wound up that only 278 people responded to this question because the way we frame the question is a little bit different than the way you're going to frame it when you're doing at-risk, because the way Kat and the team at My School DC have the information is they have it on the back end in terms of who receives services. We have to ask that question to people on the front end as our parents are canvassing with other parents and our organizers are doing that work. So we ask it in terms of the services that you've received. So have you received food support from the city? Have you received housing support from the city, right? It's not like a parent when you ask them, are you at risk, is going to answer yes. So we don't try and ask biased questions in that way. So the answers and the respondents that we got, fewer people responded, which we know sometimes happen when you're asking very personal questions, like the type of services that you're getting. But of those 278 that responded, 60% said they had received any of those services that we have here listed around housing, food, all the different supports that our city provides to families. And that number represents about 38% of the total number of families that responded in total. So that 38 is a little lower than the 46% that is in the total city, but it is still pretty close to how many. And we try and do that because of where we're going in terms of our canvassing locations. And we heard from families with different size families themselves. So you've got families that have 1 kid, you've got families that have 2+ kids, which is the largest number, you've got families that have 3 kids and 4+ children. And so you'll see that it was a pretty even split around. The biggest numbers were 1 and 2 children, but we still did have a significant number of families who had 3 and 4 or more kids. And we heard from families who had kids at all grade levels. So not surprisingly, the highest level was elementary school. That's what we usually expect. And it petered off a little bit by middle and high school. And then the second highest number was preschool and pre-K, which tracks with what Kat was sharing. And then we heard from some parents who have kids in the same school and some who don't. So 56% of parents had kids in the same school, but it's actually a really significant number to note that of the 433 people that we surveyed, 44% had kids that were in different schools. And we should think about that in terms of what the impact is on families who are having to do different pickups and drop-offs and deal with different policies and procedures at each of those schools. And if they were different schools, the families who responded that they were at 2 different schools were 55, which was the highest number, and then it went down dramatically as you got to 3 and 4. So most had kids at 2 schools, but fewer had kids at 3 or 4. You're going to hear from a parent leader, Brittany Wade, today, who has been through this experience of having kids at multiple schools, which I think is an important one to highlight, especially for our families east of the river who are sometimes traveling long distances. And then we heard from families who have kids in all different types of schools. So this is a graph that compares what our response was versus the enrollment by sector. So DCPS in terms of the whole city is 53%, and public charter schools are 47%. But in terms of our survey, we had 48% who were in DCPS, 47% who were in public charter, and we did allow families to respond if they were in other types of schooling. And so we had a small number that were in private or religious and parochial schools. And so now the question is, so we know all the data about who responded and who we represented, and it's really hard for me to speak behind the mic, by the way, because anybody who knows me and see me present knows I'm all around the room at all times. But in terms of what we heard from families about their actual experiences, The first is really around how families are using My School DC. So 93% of the respondents that we talked to had used My School DC. 5% had heard of it, but haven't used it. And then 2% have not heard of it, which is a really good indication of kind of how well the lottery is doing in terms of making sure that people know that the lottery is going on. So hats off to My School DC for the work that you guys have done there. In terms of how many times people have used it, what's really interesting is that people have used it 4 or more times is coming in at 110 folks. So that's over a quarter of the people have used it 4 or more times, which means that our families are engaging in this lottery a lot. And so we kind of see the impact of that having been on the school side before as the person who ran enrollment. The change in terms of now being able to access the lottery much more easily versus having to go to each individual school is huge. Because imagine taking that, you've applied to different schools 4 times, but then also having to go to 12 different schools as you applied, versus now you get to go to one place. And in terms of how families are using it, I think one of the things that's important is we've got a great Navigator organization that's here today, DC School Reform Now, but the majority of the respondents that we heard from are actually navigating the system themselves. And so that's actually a really good and important piece to note in terms of how are we making sure that we're reaching more families to demystify the process. While we've made it easier than what it was before 7 years ago, there's still a lot of work probably to be done to make sure that families are able to navigate the system. In terms of the interesting component, some folks said it was one of their children that helped them to navigate the system. Some folks said it was school staff. Some folks said it was a friend. We had a representative of My School DC, other organizations, and then other. But you see that the largest component really are families doing it on their own, parents doing it on their own. And so in terms of how families are using it, as we ask families about where they're getting their information from about the schools that they're applying to, 27% are getting it from the My School DC website, which is great, and that gives comprehensive data. And then the second piece is that 24% are getting it from a neighbor or community member. That's what we hear from families a lot, right? When families talk about where they get information about school, whether or not it's the schools they're in, the schools they wanted to go to, or the kinds of schools they want to imagine for the future, they're getting that information from conversations that they're having with each other. And let's be clear, that's not probably different than how all of us in this room get our information, by having conversations with each other, even if we're at a grass tops level. The second piece is around the district or school website itself. And then EdFest has 11%. A lot of the feedback that we hear from families qualitatively is that they love EdFest. It's a little overwhelming because it's all schools in one place, but it's great for equity in terms of they're able to access all of them. And then the other pieces are my representative of My School DC at 5% and a community organization at 4%. In terms of the factors that parents are looking for, because I know this is a question that we ask a lot, and as we do things like create the new school report card and try and get information and data to families and build My School DC website, the things that parents are telling us that they care about, number 1 is academic performance. Number 2 is the distance of school to home. Number 3 is school programming offerings. And the 4th is school climate. None of this is particularly different from, I think, what most of us who have ever talked to a family have heard before, but it's important to note how families are perceiving of this data. Now, academic performance and the distance are pretty close, right? So there is like a kind of correlation, doesn't mean causation, between families looking for a school that's high quality and families looking for a school that's in their neighborhood. And that's something that we often hear as well, a lot at PAVE. In terms of how families feel about My School DC, the overwhelming majority feel like it's easy to use. And so kudos to the My School DC team, because literally over 70% of families are saying that they strongly agree that the website is easy to use. You have a percentage who are neutral, and then you have some who disagree or strongly disagree. One of the things we'll get into a little bit later is that because we do canvassing by beating the street a lot of times, we don't want to preference the folks who are answering the survey via online over the families that we're meeting on the street. And so the way we do that work is doing follow-up focus groups to get better qualitative answers on why parents are choosing the selections that they're choosing. So this is just giving you the overall data if people have questions about kind of like what is the neutral group saying. And then in terms of how families feel about My School DC, they overwhelmingly feel that the system is fair. So about 50% feel the system is fair and 32% feel it's neutral, which is an important component of parents feeling like they can contribute to something, is knowing that that's something that they're contributing to in a policy process is actually fair. In terms of how they feel about what it is today versus what it was before, and we asked this question of the people who had applied prior to 7 years ago and the people who had applied now, 34% felt like it is more fair than it was 7 years ago, 53% feel it's about the same, and 13% feel that it's less fair. And so this is another question that the better way to do this is to dig in with focus groups and sit down with families to understand kind of how that's coming across for them. And then in terms of how they feel about getting the information that they needed to make the decisions for their children, 42% agreed, or 58% agreed or strongly agreed that they had the information that they wanted in order to make the decisions for their children. About a third were neutral, and very few strongly disagreed. And in terms of how they feel about the results, which is different from the information that I need to make the decision versus the actual result that I got inside of the lottery, 64% of families felt like they were happy with their results, which, in a world where you're managing thousands of applications every year, this is a good indication that families are feeling better about kind of what they're able to access in the system. And in terms of how they're feeling, whether or not their child is attending their first choice, because this is an important question that we often ask that might be a little bit different from My School DC's own data about how they're ranking, because we're not asking them how they ranked, we're asking them, was that your first choice? And sometimes we've heard from families that they're a little confused about the rankings and things like that, so we're actually asking them this question to see if they're happy with what they got and if their child is attending their first choice. And so 57% said yes, and another 15% said yes, but not for all children. And this is a great experience that Brittany's going to share as well in terms of families have a top choice, but sometimes they're not able to get all kids into that same school. And then to answer that question, 61% of families said that they were able to get all their kids into one school, into the same school, but 21% said no. So there's still nearly a quarter of families who are saying that they're not able to get all of their kids into the same school, which is an important component to think about. Now, some of that could be because there are grade level issues in terms of grade levels served versus the grade levels of the kids. These are more questions we need to dig into, but there are a large number of families that are not able to get all of their kids into the same school. And in terms of if they feel like a preference for at-risk. So the reason that we ask these questions is because I think a lot of the at-risk conversation has centered in a really positive way in terms of leaders kind of think about, does at-risk preference make sense? But at the end of the day, the public policy making that we're doing is for families. And so we also have to ask families about how they feel as we create new preferences, which was something we hadn't seen before. And I think there's a lot of perspectives that people have based upon qualitative conversations they've had with people about whether or not they think an at-risk preference is fair. But we wanted to ask that of the same families that we were surveying about their experiences with My School DC. So in terms of families that we surveyed, you will see that the large number of families said that they believe that there should be an at-risk preference for students. And that is really significant in terms of us understanding the public and the people's perspective on this, especially the people who are using the system. There was a small number that said no at 4%, and a small number that said maybe at 13%. And a lot who are neutral probably because they need more data, but another question we need to dig into about what at-risk is. Sometimes we say at-risk and people are like, I don't really know what that means or what that looks like and what the impact of that would be on me and my family. And in terms of whether or not they think that those students should have a preference above siblings, because right now, as the lottery currently stands, the highest preference at most schools that you can have is a sibling preference. And so whether or not families felt like at-risk should be above sibling preference, I actually think this is pretty significant that over a third of families felt like at-risk should have over siblings, because that doesn't service families themselves who are looking to get siblings in. And so I think this is a good indication of kind of the public's perception that we really need to take care of our at-risk kids and families. So in terms of our takeaways, we hear from a lot of families very often that parents just want more information. Based upon the data that we're seeing, one of my questions is, do parents want more information or do parents want more support in accessing that information? Because we're hearing from the data from them that they feel like there is a lot of information out there, but we are also seeing that they're navigating this process alone. And so I do think that calls into question, are we doing all that we can as a city to help families navigate? And that doesn't mean it's centered just inside of My School DC, but that's all the community-based organizations that Ariane and her team work with, in addition to other navigators that are supporting families on the ground. The next piece is that, in terms of the waitlist data, parents really want that information. They have it for some schools, but not for all. And so that's something that we hear repeatedly from families, is they want to know what that waitlist data looks like from previous years. And the last piece is one that we hear over and over again at PAVE, is really about special education services for families and what that looks like inside of schools as families are making that decision. And we know there's a complication there in terms of not wanting to provide any information that dissuades students who have special needs from applying or entering a school, but families also really want to know what are the supports available at the school level for our children. So a couple of our follow-ups. So we, as I shared, we are going to start to do some in-person focus groups and feedback sessions to better dig into the data that we have here. And we think that's important because when we bring parents together around the issue, they tend to open up a lot in conversation and let them give us that qualitative feedback that will better push the way in which we're doing this work. And then one of the things I always want to share is that canvassing is just a snapshot, right? You don't get a full picture of everything in the system just from the canvassing that we're doing. It is another good piece of data that we have to add to the other pieces, just like what Kat shared about in terms of who's accessing the system. But, we have to make sure that we're continuing to understand that it only gives us one component. The last piece I like to say oftentimes, that online surveys privilege the privileged. And even when we do online surveys, they tend to be heavily weighted towards families who are privileged. And so I think it is an important and critical part of our policymaking that we make sure that we're actually doing on-the-ground canvassing work. The canvassers who do the work for PAVE are either parents themselves or there are organizers who are used to interfacing regularly with parents. Because I think the other thing is making sure that the folks who are canvassing reflect the communities that they're canvassing. Right? Because that makes you more likely to open up in a conversation if you're talking to someone who's a parent themselves and understands your situation, or talking as a Black and brown person to someone who's Black and brown holding a clipboard trying to get information from you. And so those are things that we really have to think about as we're doing this work. And so I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for allowing us to share that data today.
The panelists could come up. Conversation. He's on. Here. Yes. It is like, okay. You just make sure you're.
I think it's on.
Yes. So my name is Tom Toch. As Chris said at the outset, I am the director of FutureEd, which is a think tank focused on public policy, and we are, as Chris noted, committed to finding solutions to improve
The mic's not working.
opportunities.
Hey, you have to hold down the button.
I have to hold it down. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm Tom Toch. Wait. Oh, I see. You don't have to hold it when you speak. You have to just turn it on. I get it. All right. So I'm Tom Toch. I'm at Georgetown, the McCourt School of Public Policy, where I run FutureEd, which is a think tank that's committed to expanding educational opportunities and outcomes for disadvantaged students, both in the district and nationally. And as we can see, and by the way, before I go further, I would like to just recognize Councilmember Silverman, who's joined us. Thank you for doing so. As we can see, there's a tremendous amount of choice in the District of Columbia today. And it's for those of you who haven't followed the evolution of education policy for decades, it is extraordinary to see how much choice there is. The city guarantees a seat in for every student in a local community school or neighborhood school, but only, as Kat pointed out, 27% of the students in the city avail themselves of that opportunity or of that sort of right. So it really is something to see how much choice there is. And as a result, what becomes critical is our ability to make school choice systems fair and efficient. And that's why we at FutureEd have looked carefully at My School DC and other common enrollment systems across the country. Kat mentioned that there are about 8 cities total now that use some version of the model because it does, using a very powerful algorithm that helped its creator win the Nobel Prize in economics in 2012, make choice fair and more efficient by connecting as many families in a city as possible to the schools that they really do want to attend. And that, as a number of speakers have said this morning, is an extraordinary change from the past when privilege begat opportunities that were distributed unfairly across student groups, across family groups, and across, indeed, entire cities. So we have an opportunity in Washington to do it right, and kudos to city leaders and other advocates in building a system that is far fairer and far more efficient. But as we've also heard, there are opportunities to build on the good work that's been done so far. And that's why we joined together with PAVE and Chris's team in the president's office at Georgetown to have this event. And we've had, I think, some really interesting insights, and we're very fortunate to have a panel who brings great additional sort of perspectives and tremendous amount of expertise to the conversation. And so let me introduce them to you. To my immediate left is Claudia Lujan, who is the Deputy Chief of Strategic School Planning and Enrollment for DCPS, the District of Columbia Public Schools, for those who are watching our video subsequently and not from the DC area. Scott Pearson is Executive Director, as you all know, of the DC Public Charter School Board. Brittany Wade, to Scott's left, is a PAVE parent leader from Ward 7. And all the way to my left is Vanessa Girardeau, who is a connected parent navigator who does the important and hard work of helping all families be able to take advantage of the choice system in the District of Columbia. So Scott, I wanted to start with you if I could. Charter schools are independent-minded organizations for sure. So the obvious question is, so why did you support the creation of a common enrollment system involving both charters and traditional public schools, two sectors, as everybody knows, that are often at each other's throats, if I could say so? And what did it take to get the charter school sort of community, especially CEOs in your sector, to sign on to the concept?
Well, I would say we're simultaneously at each other's throats and at each other's sides because we compete, but we also cooperate. And this was actually something that originally an idea that Kai Henderson and I committed to very early in 2012. I think it was my first day on the job. From my perspective...
Jump right in.
Yeah. From my perspective, there were a lot of reasons that it made sense for charter schools to do it. The first was, running a lottery is actually a lot of work and very burdensome. The second is that there was this lingering perception out there that the system was rigged, that charter schools were cheating on the lotteries, that they were handpicking students, and we wanted to do away with that. And then the third was it was just bad for families. I mean, charter schools not only ran their own lotteries, they had their own application deadlines. So families, I remember there being a Washington Post article about, consultants who would keep spreadsheets of, what dates each lottery was due. And so it just wasn't working well for families. And so those were the three reasons. But you're right, charter schools were very skeptical. They viewed this as sort of a government trap that was going to affect their ability to have control over their own futures. And so we very clearly at the beginning made it an ironclad requirement that charters should not be required to join the lottery. They had to volunteer. And so it had the very beneficial effect of forcing the designers of the lottery to think hard about how do we make this really attractive to schools. So they were incredibly participative with school leaders as well as other community members to design the lottery so that it worked with schools. An example is that the Nobel Prize winner who designed this was adamant that there be no wait lists, that wait lists would detract from the purity of his design. But our schools felt very strongly that wait lists were their security blanket, and there were examples, for example, in New Orleans, of where the lottery, didn't work quite right, and schools were left under-enrolled, and they had no wait list to go back to. So that was an example of how we did that, and I worked very hard to persuade school leaders that this was in their interest. I remember one school leader, I hope he doesn't mind my calling him out, Donald Hentz, said, I actually took him to breakfast and tried to, convince him that this was in his best interest. He said, Scott, I know you're telling me this is voluntary, but I know that's just a sham, that if I say no, then you're going to tell me that I have to join. I said, no, I won't do that. And he said, all right, well, we're not joining. And I said, okay, well, that's fine. You don't need to, and there will be no consequence. And so the meeting ended, and a week went by, 2 weeks went by, there were no consequences, and then he called me up 2 weeks later. He said, well, we've changed our mind. We decided that we'll join. And they, in fact, volunteered to be on the governance committee, and it was really helpful. The other, just very briefly, the other thing that we did was we said, we're going to create a governance process where there's 7 members, there's 3 charter members, there's 3 DCPS members, the deputy mayor is the tiebreaker, but no rule, no policy can pass unless it has at least 1 vote from each sector. And so that guaranteed both sectors, they wouldn't be steamrolled by the other.
Really interesting, thanks. So Claudia, let me ask you a similar question. You were involved in the development of My School DC from the DCPS side, and you continued to sort of oversee the effort there and are on the Common Lottery Board. So you were there at the beginning, and you continue to be actively involved. As you know, the leaders of some traditional public school systems have opposed common enrollment systems out of a belief that they'll make it easier for families to attend charter schools, right? So what was DCPS's rationale for participating?
That's a great question. So I echo a lot of what Scott said in terms of the rationale. I think the other thing, at the time before, when we first started with the first year of the Common Lottery, I was in DME. Prior to that, I was at DCPS, and we were doing our own lottery among just DCPS schools. And that in and of itself was also a trajectory, right? Before, DCPS didn't have online lottery systems, and people would line up on the street. Major equity issue there. And so we had done a lot of work over the previous few years to at least get our schools on one system. And so the opportunity to partner across the city was very exciting, particularly because one of the things we were also solving for, and what the data showed, was there was so much mobility among families and students. And we know that when we look at outcome data, mobility isn't great. Schools, students switching schools multiple times in the middle of 1 year is detrimental for a child's education. And so we were seeing that mobility happening within sectors and across sectors. And also, from sort of a planning perspective, it was really hard for our schools to plan for who was coming to them the following year, to understand, to be prepared, staff-wise, program-wise, when those numbers were constantly fluctuating and changing. And so we would have families that would enter multiple lotteries and get offered multiple seats for one student. And as a parent myself, I don't blame them for wanting to wait till the last minute to decide, because that's a big decision. And so what was happening was that then families were choosing in the summer, late summer, early fall, and then that caused a ripple effect where they would then choose one seat, it would open up 4 or 5 other seats, then folks would call off the wait list, and there was just a constant movement and churn. And we also saw that a lot of that churn impacted certain subset of schools, and schools that were already having to serve many students with high needs. And so figuring out a way to have it more predictable, not just for families and students, but also for schools, was for us something that we were very interested in doing. I think, there's an inherent conflict of, and some of our schools feel that when we are saying, hey, this is a lot of information, them feeling anxious or nervous about, listen, I want my families to stay. So for me to offer, make sure they know, I think sometimes was hard, especially early on. But I do think that ultimately at the end of the day, and this is something that we very much believed in when we established the lottery, that ultimately we have to remember what's best for students and families. And that is access to information and all of the information. I will say, which I think is really important, that we have to educate our families not just about choice, but also about their rights and their rights to attend their school of right. And that is a choice, right? So there's a lot of families that don't show up in this data that are going to the school that they want to go to because it is their neighborhood school. So there's a whole other faction that I want to just remind folks of, that this is just a portion of that. Yes, it may just be a quarter of over, but we saw this year our numbers go up. More than 900 more students than the previous year have opted to attend their in-boundary school this year. And those numbers are going up every year. So I want to remind folks that that the choice happens across sectors within DCPS. As we have citywide schools, we have selective schools. But there's also a choice in attending your neighborhood school. And so I think we need to all sort of remember that. And as I know for us in our schools, as we educate our families, part of that is about, here's what you have a right to attend, and here's the school in your neighborhood. Many of them are in close proximity, as we know that proximity is a factor that many families are considering. So for us, it is something we think about, but it's also a really good opportunity for us to use this as to educate our families about our neighborhood school system and about the feeder patterns and about schools that they have a right to attend, because those are equally important.
Yeah, really important point. Thank you. So you alluded to wait lists and the musical chairs that used to take place sort of through the summer and into the early fall as families tried to find the right fit for their kids. But now my school, DC, actually runs the wait list too for every school in the city. Why did that happen? And given the concern perhaps in the charter sector early on, and what's the consequence of that been?
I think one of the things that we thought was also very easy is that there's an easiness to a centralized system. And so when now again, all of our schools have access to the waitlist system. This is not something that my school DC patrols or monitors who gets a waitlist offer, but schools directly have access. I think what's helpful is that just practically from an operational perspective, it ties in closely with the application. It was a decision that, at least for us, made sense, and that we could all sort of have it in one place. That said, the waitlist policies are different across sectors, and there are different preferences across LEAs. And it's all tailored for the individual LEA's policies. So it is not a situation where it's we at least don't feel in any way that my school DC plays some sort of big brother role in that wait list. In fact, I think it's just it's an ease of use to have that centralized and to have that align up with the application so that it's a seamless transition of information and data.
Scott, what's the charter community's sort of response to my school DC running the wait list?
I think for the most part, people would agree with Claudia that it administratively simplifies things. There are cases where schools would have used their discretion to say, there's a particular hard need case, a safety transfer from another school, and we'll bring this student used to go to our school and then they went out of town and now they're back and they really want to come back, and they would have made the decision to let that student in and jump the wait list. And now that can't be done, and I think it leads school leaders to feel sometimes a little frustrated that they can't make those decisions that seem like the right thing, even though it violates the purity of the wait list.
So it's complicated. Brittany, we've heard a lot of other folks this morning sort of share parent perspectives. You're a parent, you're on the ground. I think it would be important for us to hear from you. your reaction to the My School DC Common Enrollment system. What does it do for parents that the previous model didn't?
I think the previous model, the My School DC is helping parents make more informed decisions. I know when it first rolled out, I used it for my oldest daughter. She was, what grade was she going? I think she was going to second grade. And we were attending our neighborhood school. Was not great. I live in Ward 7. I'm a Ward 7 resident. I love Ward 7, but our schools are not where they need to be, not for my child. So I did the first lottery for her. She got into her first pick. I did all the research. I actually went to the schools. I had to get out there and do it. Now, I'm a parent that I can, fortunately, I can go do that because I'm a stay-at-home mom. But there are a lot of other parents that can't not go to the school to check out the culture, to see how warm and welcoming it is when a parent is walking through the door. So those are the things that are kind of missing with that My School DC can't tell you. But for me, it was very important for me to get a feel for the school. But My School DC gave me that open window to maybe the information that I needed as far as park scores and things like that may be important for a lot of parents. But I personally wanted to go into the school. So, but My School DC it's also been a great tool to use, and it's been fairly easy for me as a parent to get online to see what waiting list my child is on, all those things. It's a little frustrating because now I have 5 children. Most of my children, like I said, I live in Ward 7. Most of my children attend schools in Ward 6. I have one pre-K3 child that is attending Educare DC right now because he didn't get in school with his sisters. So that is a challenge for my family, and I know a lot of other families, to make sure that our children are getting to the schools on time. Just making sure that they feel, because my 3-year-old, he loves to be with his sisters. He wants to go everywhere they go. So it was a big deal this year when he didn't get into school with them. He knew everybody at the school and all that kind of stuff. So he just, he thought he was going with them this year. So we had to break it to him that he was not. So there are difficult challenges, but My School DC, I can say overall, makes it a fairly easier process when dealing with that school choice that we do have in the city.
Interesting. So to Scott's point about the co-opetition between the charter sector and DCPS, there is, as of this year, a new unified school rating system across all LEAs, the DCPS and all the individual charter sectors, which I think is pretty uncommon, both in the way it was developed cooperatively and in the fact that it even exists. Vanessa, let me ask you, what do you see as the keys to making the common lottery work for parents? What's most important? I mean, Brittany alluded to transportation. That's part of it for sure, but what else is in the mix?
For just the school lottery component, I think definitely just the transparency aspect, cutting down on that. I mean, not everyone's going to understand the algorithm, but just trying to be as transparent as possible with families about how it actually works, and just getting the information to them. And I think My School DC does a really good job of trying to get the information to families. But we all know that there's just this set of families that we're often not reaching, and I think that's where the Navigator organizations come in. But I definitely think that in order to make it successful, the lottery, having a common school lottery is just like one piece of the pie. Transportation, a transportation plan would be another piece of the pie. I think navigators are another piece of the pie. It's just to have a perfect, equitable and fair process, and it just is going to take a lot. And just having a lottery is one slice of it.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about the Navigator program that you're part of. How does it work?
So I'm with Discern, well, Connect Ed. We're in the transitioning our name. And basically what we do is we often partner with schools or other community-based organizations and work with their families to help navigate through the school choice process and the lottery process. And so a lot of the schools that we work with, we work with families that are transitioning from like Apple Tree. We have a strong partnership with them because their families are all transitioning from pre-K 4 to kindergarten. Elementary schools will work with them and work primarily with like their 5th grade families that are transitioning to middle schools. And then obviously middle schools with their 8th graders transitioning to high school. But that's not to say that we work with all families, but those are the buckets that we really target because we know that they are going to have to enter the lottery. Well, not have to, but most likely going to enter the lottery. And so, our families will fall into generally like 2 to 3 buckets. There's like the families that don't really need a lot of help, that they can navigate it on their own and they don't really need a lot. I have other families that just need some guidance and helping to process the information that's being thrown at them and talking to them about their children, their strengths, their needs, and interest, and trying to find out what their transportation is like to help suggest some schools to them that might work for their family. If they have siblings, all that stuff. And then I will just usually offer like a set of schools as a suggestion, and they might do the lottery application on their own, or they might need some assistance. And then I have families who, we really want to reach, which need everything. They might need me to do from start to finish the whole selection and lottery process. They might not have internet. They might not have a computer at home. They may not be literate. I mean, it just is a variety of issues that are barriers that are keeping them from participating in this process as on a level playing field. So I think that that's what we try to do, is really just level the playing field when it comes to just accessing the lottery.
So showing them the website, explaining how to navigate the website, identify different characteristics of schools, helping them literally fill out their choices. Each student gets to select up to 12 choices a year, right?
Yes.
All of that. And interestingly, 40%, I think, Kat, tell me if I'm right on this, about 40% of the families in my school DEC are applying via their cell phones, which helps bridge the digital divide. And I think an important sort of innovation that you've created.
Yes, definitely. So I think that, just being able to help families to, navigate, it could be showing them the website. It could just be, we, on our website, we have virtual school tours that help family get a glimpse into a day of what a school looks like. Those things, I think, don't translate through the report card all the time. Like, you have test scores and you have like, in the, the closest bus lines and things like that, but on paper. But to see the school, see how the kids interact, I always say that the lunchroom scene is my favorite scene because it really shows you like what a real school, like if the kids are happy and they're playing, like that's really telling you something about the school that they're doing right, because you can't fake that, So just having those virtual school tours as a resource for families, I think is great as well. But And I'm a parent as well, and I've navigated the school lottery process a few times, and I've had various experiences. My kids have gone to charter, now they're in DCPS, and just even being able to share my experiences with various charter systems, with the process, I think also helps families feel, have that sense of trust that, we're in it together in a sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. So, as we all know, the District of Columbia schools have traditionally been quite isolated by socioeconomic status and by race. And I'm wondering, from a sort of policy perspective, if you have thoughts on the extent to which My School DC, by enabling more movement across schools across the city, together with the ability, a policy decision to give families the ability to move outside of their neighborhood schools, is having a positive effect on our efforts to desegregate our schools. Well.
I think that's a great question. I think we at DCPS have been thinking about this for a while. And I think as we have seen the demographics of our neighborhoods change, we see that play out in our schools. We see schools that look very different in their pre-K classrooms than they do in their fifth grade classrooms. And we're all sort of, not only are we centrally at DCPS, but our families, our schools, our teachers, our parents are all navigating those changes. And so one of the things that, from a policy perspective, that we're doing, as Kat alluded to, is implementing a new at-risk preference at Stevens Early Learning Center.
Just to back up slightly.
Yep.
So explain to everybody the preference system and
Sure.
the impact that it, perhaps, the existing system is having on desegregation efforts.
Yep. So the way that, at least, again, the way that a lottery works for a DCPS neighborhood school, which is different than it works for a charter school or a DCPS citywide school that doesn't have a boundary, is that we first give a preference, a geographical preference, based on the boundary that the school is located in. So even though, so all pre-K seats are lottery-based. So a family who lives in boundary for a certain school does not have a right to attend that school at pre-K. That right triggers at kindergarten, which means that at pre-K, we give a preference to the families first that live within that boundary above families that live outside of that boundary. And then that is, we also have the sibling preference, so we have in boundary with sibling preference is the highest, and sort of goes from there. And it can get complicated, right? There's a lot of different preference orders for families to understand which schools have it, which schools don't, and so it can be overwhelming quickly. And so what we have seen, and actually this, as you guys have all known, like the conversation about at-risk preference has been out in the ether for many years. This is not a new concept. Folks across sectors have been talking about it. Families, communities have been talking about it. It was part of the boundary plan that came out several years ago. It was one of the recommendations there. It came out through the cross-sector task force that the DME led. It was in that process that My School DC also did the most recent analysis of what the impact of an at-risk preference would look like. And one of the things that did come out in part of that analysis was that the impact looks different across different schools depending on the demand and depending on the other preference orders. So one of the things that came out is if you're competing with an in-boundary preference and you have a lot of demand for the in-boundary preference, the impact of an at-risk preference, if the family is out of boundary, is going to be very minimal.
Right.
Because there's a certain number of seats there.
Yeah, just to jump in parenthetically, the problem with the in-bound sort of preference, or in-boundary preference and the sibling preference, is that, understandably, families who are within the boundaries of what they believe to be good schools avail themselves of that opportunity, and so then it becomes very difficult for kids out of boundary to get in, and where this is happening most is in Ward 3, and where schools are whiter and richer, and so it makes it difficult to get more kids of color, more lower income kids into those schools because there are no seats open through the lottery.
Yep. I think that is a factor. I do think, though, we have schools that are in, again, this directly links to housing policies and neighborhoods, right? And so it is hard to disconnect from what drives the demographics of a community. I think that we also have areas of the city that are geographically and by nature demographically diverse, yet we are still seeing a disparity. And that I think goes back to some of the points that Kat made, is we know that while the numbers are getting better, we know that many of our families who qualify as at risk or who would qualify as at risk aren't entering the lottery at the time of the deadline. The lottery they're sort of exercising, learning this throughout. The timeline is different for those families. And I think that plays into that. So we're seeing that not just play out in neighborhoods that are already homogeneous by nature and housing, but we're not seeing the diversity even when it exists in the neighborhood completely reflected in those schools. So there's a different, and I think this is where we have to really be clear about what we're trying to solve for as we think about policies. And for us, the idea and the opportunity to implement this policy at Stevens was a good opportunity for us to pilot. One, Stevens is a citywide center currently, right? So it will not have a boundary. So we will not have that dynamic.
In Ward 2, right?
Yes. And so it will also not only allow us to think about what does that do from enrollment patterns, but also school choice patterns and parent choice. How does that play into that? And then operationally, also thinking about how do we implement this preference, which is very different and new. We don't ask families whether or not they receive these benefits up front on the application. That's something that I think across sectors we hold true, that we don't want to ask those kinds of questions so that we don't want to, again, muddle for families the perception that may be used in making any decisions. So we're doing this on the back end, which operationally is a bigger lift. But I think for us, what it will show, what we're interested in seeing is what does that look like? What does that mean? And how would we, in the future, depending on what we're seeing the impact, how would we leverage that or scale that, depending on what we're trying to solve for at a broader level across other schools.
Interesting. Are you putting the at-risk preference above in boundary? Well, there's no in boundary because it's citywide, so that makes it easier. Right. And it's a new program, so there's no sibling.
That's right.
So smart move to pilot it there. Let's jump to questions. Please be thinking of ones you have. Yes, Councilmember Summer.
Yeah, so we put the charter system in place to be these pockets of innovation that would then feed back and improve outcomes for DCPS too. But help me explain how your data shows that. In fact, I think your data is showing the opposite. Because what we see in the Ward 2 and 3 data is that parents that are content with their neighborhood and boundary DCPS schools don't want choice. They're not in the lottery. And then in Ward 7 and 8, we're seeing increasing numbers of parents going into lottery saying they're less and less satisfied with their DCPS choice. And then, it gets to this question of equity in our school. I guess I'm struggling to see how the lottery and quote choice is helping parents who choose to stay in their DCPS Ward 7 and 8 school.
So the way we designed the lottery was to be a complete even field for everybody. So we have many families from Wards 2 and Ward 3 apply to public charter schools. It's not, in Ward 3 there are no public charter schools, but they're applying to go to schools in Wards 2 and 4 and 6. So we see that across the board, and families always have the right to attend their neighborhood school. So the lottery only adds to their choice set. It doesn't take away from their choice set. It's very important, I think, not to conflate racial diversity with economic diversity. For example, we have public charter school. There's not a single public charter school that is more than 50% white. We have many diverse schools. None are more than 50% white, but we have many public charter schools, for example, that are more than 50% affluent of all races. And so what we hear from those schools is that's not what we started out to do. We started out to serve, yes, the whole community, but we specifically wanted to offer great options for low-income families for whom this could be a benefit. And so they're asking for an at-risk preference so that they can, avoid a lottery that is on its face completely fair, completely equitable, but when they have thousands of applicants from families from wards 2 and 3, kind of overwhelming the number of applicants that they have from low-income families, they're finding that the results of the lottery are producing a student body that isn't what they had set out in their mission to serve.
And Washington Latin is one such charter that is seeking to implement an at-risk preference in one of its new campuses?
Every one of our schools that have at-risk percentages of under 20% have all asked for an at-risk preference, and that's why the Public Charter School Board has partnered with the Century Foundation to push for this, because it's clear that schools want it, and what we see from the PAVE data is that parents want it as well.
Other questions? Yes, in the back.
So with the...
Oh, sorry. Do you want to respond to this?
I just wanted to say the lottery. I don't know if it's completely fair. I'm going to say that because as we saw with the data, Ward 7 and 8 are the one, those are the areas where we need the help. The schools need the help, and you're going to continue no matter how you try to in at risk, not at risk. Those schools are the ones that are failing. Those schools, they're the parents that can take their kids from that area and send them somewhere else, they're doing so. For those people that are, the children that are attending their neighborhood schools, I guarantee you, and I've talked to a lot of people, I live right next door to Drew Elementary School. I'm not sending my child to Drew Elementary School because I know that they're not getting the same funding that Ludlow Taylor is getting, that my children have been at. I know I'm not sending my 12-year-old daughter to Kelly Miller because I know Kelly Miller is not getting the funding that Stuart Hobson is getting. So that is the root issue. That is the root issue. I don't know any other way to put that, because affluent, I am not. I'm a stay-at-home mom. My husband works full-time. Both of us are veterans. We have been homeless. We have been a lot of things, but we have worked our way up. So whatever at risk it is, I just know that I want my kids to have a great education. And they're not going to get that over in Ward 7 and 8 unless I am in the school every day making sure that somebody is doing their job, because they are not getting the funding that they need. We've already seen the data from here. We've seen the data in PAVE. There is nothing else that I can say about that one.
Well, I would just add that your involvement in your school and in the school system generally is sort of crucially important, and so thank you for that. It is the case that in DC you have many, many options that in many school districts you would not have. You would be at Kelly Miller.
But also, I would just say I would love to take you on a tour of many public charter schools in Ward 7 and 8 that I think are fabulous, and I'll bet Claudia would make the same offer.
Yeah. I do think that, what we're seeing here is the intersection between choice and quality, right? And so I think this is how it's playing out, right? And it's playing out in a lot of different ways. I think to your point, there's the funding aspect of it, how does that translate from a funding perspective at a school level? But I do think that at least from DCPS's perspective, we are always trying to balance the notion that we have families, whether they choose or not choose to enroll at Drew or anyone, they are there. And it is our responsibility to do everything that we can to provide as high quality education as we can for those families. It may not be happening. I know it's not happening to the level that we want it to be, but it is what we strive to do every single day. And I think that at the same time, we are seeing families who can navigate that and are maybe choosing. It may not be a charter school. They may be choosing another DCPS school, like Ludlow Taylor. And so I think for us, there is it is a balance that we have to navigate from DCPS's perspective to ensure that families feel like they have a confidence in our system. At the same time, ensuring that we are doing everything we can from a resource and a program perspective to be offering quality options to all of our families, particularly by right at all of our schools. Because whether Ludlow Taylor is, we have all of our schools that serve a lot of out-of-boundary families, but they are also neighborhood schools for a subset of families. And so wanting to ensure that we are offering high quality across, I think makes sense.
Okay. Yes.
Yes. I also agree with Brittany as far.
Thank you very much.
I agree that although we have school choice and like you were saying, everybody has a right to have their child attend a neighborhood school. I myself also wouldn't have my students attend their neighborhood school. But also, so I think I agree that not only with choice, but we also need to make sure that neighborhood schools are performing as well as other schools like Ludlow Taylor. I don't know if it's necessarily a thing of they're getting different funding, because I don't think that's the thing. I think it's more so when you have a certain set of parents in the school that can fundraise and can have connections to provide different things within the school. I think that's where the difference comes. I don't think it's necessarily Wheatley is getting different funding than Ludlow Taylor. I think it's more so the parents navigating different funding streams is what is causing that difference, and the parent involvement. My question is, I do see a lot of segregated schools. For example, one day I saw Brent going on a field trip. All the students on the field trip were Caucasian. There was not one student of color, not one Asian student, not one Hispanic student going on this field trip. And so I want to know, even with the at-risk preference, how is that going to help the school become less segregated if students are still receiving an in-boundary preference? So if families are able to afford the $800,000 houses in those neighborhoods, they can move into those neighborhoods, they get the in-boundary preference, and their kid goes to those schools. But with the at-risk preference coming secondary to that, how does the school ever become less segregated?
Yes, I think that is, as I mentioned earlier, is a challenge when we have a neighborhood system. It comes down to what are, the only way to innately change that is two ways. One is to redraw the boundary, right, in a way that allows for the inclusion or allows for a diversity within the neighborhood. And then another way is to ensure that we are either saving or ensure that we have a certain subset of out-of-boundary seats that are always available, made to be available. And there's sort of challenges with both, but those are essentially when one thinks are the initial levers, those are the first two. When we redrew boundaries back in 2014, the impetus there was not to change where we didn't have to change. We're coming up to another redraw in 2022. And I think this is going to be, a pivotal question that we're going to have to ask ourselves as a city is how do we approach that? I think in 2014 and 2015, when we first did that, a lot of it was cleanup work, where boundaries just didn't make sense. There was a lot of misalignment. But there were opportunities where we actually had to redraw new boundaries. And in that case, for example, I remember it was Van Ness Elementary School. I think it hadn't quite opened yet. And there were a couple iterations of that draft boundary in which we also have a housing development, a lot of new development done in that area, as you guys may be aware. But there's also a lot of low-income housing. And so one of the things that we were very made sure that we did is that we drew the boundaries so that we didn't have one essentially high-income school and another low-income school. And we were able to do that within that neighborhood, knowing what we know about housing and other patterns. And I think it's going to be a question for us as we approach the 2022 time for redrawing, how are we going to think differently about our diversity policies and think about how we're seeing segregation play out within our schools. And that's going to be a time for us, not only for DCPS to wrestle, but for us to wrestle with it as a city, to really think about what does that mean for our policies, whether it's capacity, out-of-boundary seats, or whether it's student assignment and actual boundaries.
Thanks, Chloe. That's one reason why we're having this event this morning, is to begin to air these questions. Before you ask your question, just one observation to the council members' suggestion that charters and traditional schools have a sort of learning relationship. It's my sense that DCPS has launched many new innovative dual language programs, Montessori programs, STEM programs, in no small measure in response to the development or emergence of those sorts of programs in the charter sector. So there is a sort of symbiotic sort of synergy, if you will, that seems to be emerging a little bit. Yes.
So my question is sort of focused on the demand side of the equation, for lack of a better way to characterize this. Wait lists. To what extent is policymaking and planning, boundaries and the rest upcoming, focused on that, the size of the wait list, both on the charter side of the equation and on the out-of-boundary entry into traditional public schools? Is that taken into consideration in terms of your planning from a resources perspective, facilities, money, et cetera?
Let you respond, but one sort of dimension, one sort of consequence of the My School DC system is that we have a clearer sense of exactly how many people are on wait lists, because many families, as Claudia said, are on multiple wait lists, and as a result, it sort of inflates or otherwise makes more opaque the actual situation.
Good point. Yep.
One of the benefits that came with My School DC is that it has made the wait lists a better indicator. And here's why. If you apply to 11 schools and you get into your 5th ranked choice, you will only be put on the wait list for the schools that are above that is schools 1 through 4. Whereas in the old days, you would have been on lots of wait lists. The other thing that My School DC lets us do is not only see how many individual names are there on wait lists, but how many individuals there are. Because if a student might be on 3 wait lists, but it's just one student. And so, for example, every spring we report not only the total wait list sizes, but also how many individual students are on wait lists. The other thing that we've seen, though, is that wait lists are an important indicator, but they're not a perfect indicator. I hear from lots of schools that they maybe have some students who don't show up, and then they start calling through their wait list, and they don't always get everybody on the wait list. Sometimes they call through dozens and dozens, and people say, well, I know I was on the wait list, but it's the middle of September, my child is in this other school, and I'm actually happy, which is great news, actually. So we take it into account when schools apply to us, let's say to replicate. We want some evidence from them that they will indeed be serving a need, and the wait list numbers are one important indicator that we use.
Thank you.
I agree. Wait lists are one piece of sort of the answer, but it is not comprehensive. And I think wait lists also are used differently, at least for us. The demand data at the pre-K level is very different than when we look at sort of at K-12. So we definitely use that when we're thinking about pre-K expansion classrooms. We also, because we have the preference order in terms of how many are in boundary or not, it also helps us paint a picture for some schools who, again, have limited number of pre-K seats. We then can say, but we have several of these families who are in boundary. We expect them to come back at kindergarten. And so then that helps us from a planning perspective as we think about space in classrooms. But it is not the only indicator when we think about demand. I think particularly as we've been talking about, and again, I think it looks very different in different areas of the city, is that we know that many of our families furthest from opportunity aren't always, when we look at wait lists come, April 1st, they look very different than when we're looking at them later in the summer. And particularly from other schools where we have families who are furthest opportunity aren't going to be on the wait lists in April. There's a very high chance that they're not, right? And so many of those families will opt in later on, particularly, and this is especially helpful for pre-K. And so really looking at wait lists throughout the summer is also helpful for us. But again, it is not the only pieces of information as we think about planning.
So Tom, I know we're over time.
We are over time. So if everybody would like, happy to do one more question.
We had one back here from a parent leader.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on.
No problem. Good morning. My name is Renee Davis, and I'm a Ward 1 parent, but I'm also a native Washingtonian and an alumni of a specialized high school in DCPS. Mm-hmm. But my question today is an overall question as a parent of 2 children with disabilities. Due to the nature of my children having a medically based disability and having not a 504 plan but a IEP, one of the most discouraging aspects of the My School DC program for me since 2013 has been the lack of information about how the programs at the different schools, whether they're the charter sector or the public sector, are doing in terms of servicing and providing opportunities for our children with disabilities. One of the questions has always been asked has been, well, if I can't, as a parent, tell you that my child has an IEP or a 504, how can you prepare adequately for my child if we get ranked through the wait list or even get ranked with our first choice? And my second question for that is, there's also a lack of information about the physical plant of the buildings or of the schools within My School DC. I'd like to be able to do a query and see how many schools have elevators, how many schools have functioning, how many paraprofessionals are partnered within a particular school. What's the graduation rate for people with disabilities that have 504 or IEPs actually in that particular school? So again, I'm asking, I know there's a question about equity, but equity without an attention to Americans with disabilities, whether they're my pre-K 3, 4, 5-year-old who's just newly diagnosed, or my rising 9th grader looking at whether they can stay on a diploma track and graduate or not. Those are the issues that I hope that we look forward to My School DC and all the community partnership organizations can help address.
Thank you. That's an important question. Anybody want to respond briefly? Yeah, go ahead.
This is a wobbly chair. So I'll just speak as a navigator, a parent navigator quickly. That I think that we recognize that that's one area that we want to strengthen our support for families with children who are in special education, and really being able to identify where those programs are, what other parents' experiences have been. We know that personnel changes within school. You can have a great special education coordinator and then they leave, and things like that. But we want to stay on top of what special education services that schools have so that we can relay that to our parents. Some parents aren't comfortable sharing their children's special needs with us, and that's okay, but the more that parents share with us, the better we're able to navigate for them the schools that we know have really strong support in those areas. And I also just wanted to say that I think that speaks to what I was saying earlier about just the pieces of the pie that really will make this system truly fair and equitable is that piece of being able to identify for families where we know that their kids will get service and get the best education for their specific child. But that goes into those special education services. It goes into transportation, and it's great that you have that choice and ability if you're living in Ward 8 and you want your kid to go to Wilson, but if you can't get them to Wilson, there's no point of you getting that spot. So just identifying what the barriers are and really trying to break them down. But again, like I think having the lottery is one great success and step in that, but we're just not there yet as a Navigator organization, I'll say.
Is there a chance that the equity, that the at-risk weight can include special education in some form?
The law in DC, so charter schools are not allowed at-risk weights at all, but we are allowed, schools are allowed to apply for us for a special education preference, and we have one school, Bridges Public Charter School, that does that. And specifically, it was kind of a waste of resources. They'd set up a special room that had lots of sensory things, they'd staff it appropriately, and then they would wait for the luck of the lottery to see whether they had enough students to fill that room, and that seemed crazy. So the council worked with us to set up something so that they can make sure that when they staff a classroom for a particular type of student with disability, they can fill that classroom.
And I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. I mean, I think for DCPS, there's students that have over a certain number of IEP hours don't have to go through the lottery and actually go through a placement process with our special education team. Because the number of hours are such that there are specialized programs for those, and those typically are, not in all cases, but in some cases, are self-contained, non-categorical. The actual vision for Stevens Early Learning Center is that it be both socioeconomically diverse, but also ability diverse. So of the classrooms that we're opening there, so currently we have 8 classrooms planned, 3 of them are special education, self-contained classrooms. So those seats won't be in the lottery, we'll go through a placement process. And so it's a little bit of, from DCPS perspective, there's different ways to access those seats that, depending on the number of hours, you actually go through a placement process more so to make sure that we sort of have the needs can be met. Otherwise, you do sort of go through the lottery. And to your point, it's a little tricky. Some families feel very uncomfortable offering that information on the front end. That information, though, is what we ask families to provide at the time of enrollment. And so that from a planning perspective, if they get a match, they're able to enroll in April. And then if they disclose that they have an IEP, the special education coordinator reviews that, ensures that they can be serviced there, or goes through the placement process to be offered another seat.
So I think we could probably go on for a while because these issues are interesting and complicated, but I think we should probably wrap up. So I would ask you to join me in thanking the panelists and our partners and our speakers earlier on today.